Okay, so today we're talking about pleats and tucks. So what are pleats and tucks? Pleats and tucks are ways to control fullness in fabric. Unless your fabric is a stretch fabric, there needs to be more fabric to go around the body than the smallest part of the body. So gathering is sort of a random way of pulling all that fabric in. So you could just have a drawstring, like at the top of a pair of sweatpants, or it could be sewn to a waistband. Pleats are more controlled and more planned than gathering. That is the major difference between pleats and gathers. So what is a pleat? A pleat is a fold, generally planned into the fabric. Sometimes it is folded in one direction, and sometimes it's folded in two directions, such as a box pleat. Okay, but pleats are intentional so that you hold the fabric down in place, but that at another part of the fabric, it can stretch and be fully extended. We think about doing it at the waistband of a skirt so it fits smooth over the waist and the hips, but then it flares out when it gets to the knees, for example. Most pleats we think of go in one direction, but they can be slightly different still. The skirt on the left has unpressed pleats, so they're still stitched at the waistband. They're actually stitched down, so they have a release point. The release point is at the bottom of the stitching so that the pleats can kick out. But you notice the one on the left is unpressed, and the one on the right, they're very sharp edges to the pleats. They're pressed. And when you have a sharp edge, it doesn't have to be stitched, though it can be stitched. That's called a knife pleat. So if you want your pleats to be extremely sharp, you would do what's called an edge stitch along the fold on each of those pleats, and that would keep those super tight in there. There are pleating grids, so if you're doing something that has a lot of small pleats in it, you can fold the fabric into it's not really cardboard, but it's like cardboard, and then you iron it that way. The easiest way to get a whole piece of fabric pleated is to send it off to the professionals who have machines that will heat press those pleats into the fabric so that they never go away. If you wash a garment with pleats, oftentimes the pleats are going to go away, and then you need to press them back in. So that's something to consider when you're choosing to wash a pleated garment instead of dry cleaning a pleated garment. Box pleats are a fun pleat to use when you want to work with alternating or contrasting colors. This is what you generally see on a cheerleading skirt, an example there. But it's not always that way. They're used a lot in period clothing, so it's a good thing to know. And it's a way of creating panels in the skirt. Whether you do the box pleat to the outside or inverted, in the end, side by side, they have the same. But you'll notice the one on the left releases at the waistband, whereas the illustration of the cheerleading skirt has it stitched down and together. So that would be an inverted box pleat because the blue panels are stitched down several inches so that the red is revealed underneath, or the pink, depending on what you're seeing there. So those are box pleats. They go back and forth, not all in one direction. Another type of pleat that is used a lot in theater is the cartridge pleat. And the cartridge pleat does, if you're doing it by hand, it takes a lot more time to do. And generally in theater, they are done by hand. You can go to your local Joann's and purchase what's called box pleating tape. Now, box pleating tape is great if you're sewing curtains because it holds all of the pleats exactly the same. The problem with using that in something, say, like this skirt that you see there on the left, is that pleat has to be super tight at the waist, but as it moves out 6 to 8 inches, it needs to release just a little bit because that circle fans out away from the body. So you can't have those threads all be the same. And that's why more often than not, those are hand stitched in as opposed to using a box pleating tape or cartridge pleating tape. One of the places that we see it in modern clothing is in graduation robes. Along the yoke, which is the top of the bodice of a graduation gown, you'll find cartridge pleating and often over the shoulders controlling the top of the sleeves. And that is because they are based on medieval garments. And so they still use that shaping technique, and it's become traditional to use cartridge pleating in your graduation gowns. Ruffs, which we use when we're doing Elizabethan plays, are a form of cartridge pleating. And so there on the left, you see you can have a sharp or a soft. The pleats, the rounded pleats on a ruff are actually called gophers. Gophers. You do not need to memorize that unless you take the history of clothing class next semester. You'll need to know what that is, but they're referred to as gophers, and they actually had what looked like curling irons, because the only way to really iron this once it's made is to use something specific to that shape. You can't reshape it. So it looks like a modern curling iron, and that is what they use to create the rounded edges or the gophers on a ruff. Ruffs are 100% hand stitched because there is no way to, if you notice in the middle of the illustration on the right, it shows how those pleats are sitting on the neck edge. It's the same thing if you're doing a skirt on a waistband. You have to hand stitch that on there because it's creating a dimensional effect. So cartridge pleats are really used when you want to make a dimensional effect. Okay, so what are tucks? Tucks are really just small pleats. Okay, the most common tucks are what are called pin tucks. Pin tucks are a maximum of 1/8 to 1/4 of an inch in size. They're evenly distributed. They're often in a series. You'll find them a lot in men's period shirts. You will also find them on tuxedo shirts because tuxedo shirts are a remnant of times past, and so that's why you have those tucks in the front. Generally, tucks hold where you have a full garment, where you want it to have less fullness in it. It will have those tucks in it, and then it'll flare out underneath those tucks. It's commonly used in women's clothing across the top, and then it flares out over the bust. And then in period clothing, it might have tucks again at the waist that pull it back in. And so it helps create shape to the garment. Tucks can be decorative or functional. You'll see pin tucks or small tucks a lot in babies' clothing. Okay, and there's that example on the right. But there's another way that we use tucks that is functional. On the right, you see a petticoat. Now, this was used functionally throughout time. You had a dress, but you didn't have a lot of money. So you have a dress for, say, your 3-year-old child, but you don't want to cut the fabric off. So what you would do is there across the bottom, you would do a series of tucks. So they look decorative, but they're actually functional. As your child gets taller, all you have to do is unsew one of those tucks and drop the hem down. We use this a lot in theater and costume stock. You'll go into our costume stock, you'll see many of our skirts and our petticoats have tucks sewn into them. And that's so we can use the same petticoat on someone who might be 5'4" tall and someone who's 5'9" tall. So we usually cut our skirts as long as possible, and then we'll sew tucks into them to make them short. That way we don't have to have the exact same skirt, small, short for one person, and large, tall for another person. Either way. So you'll see that a lot in period clothing. You can see it in reruns of say something like Little House on the Prairie. They use that. And so it looks decorative. It's really pretty. But actually, if the dress has been washed or worn frequently and it fades, when you release those tucks, the tucks won't have faded. And so they make another decorative band of the darker original color, and they remain that decorative band on there. So sometimes it wasn't actually that a decoration was sewn on the dress, it was actually where the tuck had been let out. And so that's a functional way that we use tucks all the time in theatrical costuming. Now, for your second mask, you will be making a mask that has pleats in it. Those are folded to control. So the first mask that you did is gathered and has elastic in it. The second one you make will still have elastic in it, but rather than gathering, it lays flat on the sides because it has some, you could call them tucks, but they're really pleats. There's a planned folding of the fabric to control the fullness in the mask, side of the mask. And you'll see that when you cut it out, how it's planned. And then when you sew it together, you fold it. And that is why I'm talking about pleats and tucks today.